Hello, BookTube. This is Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and I'm here to do a review I'm very excited for. It's a book called Uncertain Glory by a Catalan author whose name I've tried to look at the International Phonetic Alphabet to figure out how to pronounce it in Catalan, but I believe it's Joan Sales, not Joan Sales. But it's a novel set during the Spanish Civil War, so it occurs in 1936 and 1937. And part of it takes place in Barcelona, part of it takes place along the Catalan Aragonese front during the Spanish Civil War. It is fiction. It's a novel, but in aspects of it, it very much reads like nonfiction. It is the author Sales was Catalan. It was actually not written in Spanish. It was written in Catalan, sort of a language / Spanish dialect, as far as I understand, that is from that part of Spain where Barcelona is. And Sales did fight in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. He fought on the losing side, on the anarchist, communist, Republican side, kind of, use whatever term you would like from that group of movements. And after that side was defeated, he moved to France. Obviously, in 1940, Nazi Germany came into France, and so he left France. And he kind of moved around before, after World War II, he ended up going back to Spain, living there in Barcelona, in that area, and really trying to find sort of preserving Catalan culture during the Franco regime, which is a very there wasn't freedom of the press or a lot of freedoms, and so he worked hard to preserve the regional writings in the Catalan language, preserve that sort of cultural identity. And while that was going on, he wrote this novel. This novel is amazing. It's a book I had never heard of. I had never heard of this author. I simply picked it up. You can imagine why. This spine stands out on a used bookstore shelf. And so I trust new NYRB classics. I kind of picked it up and took a look at the back. And it's Spain, 1937, posted to the Aragonese front. Lieutenant Ruiz Ruscalleda eschews the drunken antics of his comrades and goes in search of intrigue. It's a Spanish Civil War novel. It is, in my opinion, it's probably one of the best books I've read in the past 6 months at least, and it is hands down the best Spanish Civil War novel book I've yet to read. And yes, that includes For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. I had actually pulled that down and was like, oh, I wonder if it'll be like For Whom the Bell Tolls. And then as I was reading, I was like, oh no, it's vastly superior to For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I actually like For Whom the Bell Tolls. Uncertain Glory, though, is just an absolute knockout masterpiece. It's amazing. It takes place in sort of 3 parts. So the first part is all narrated in sort of an epistolary style, but it doesn't read that way, where that Lieutenant Ruiz, who's from Barcelona, is posted to the front in this tiny sort of village area, and he ends up becoming involved in an intrigue with a woman who is the widow, but maybe they were never actually married, of the local lord who had been murdered by the anarchists, and she had 2 children by that man. And there's a whole question of, did they marry? Would their children be able to inherit, all of his wealth and his estate? Is there even going to be an estate to inherit, if the anarchist / Republican side wins? And so that's the first third. And we also see a little bit of battle going on. So we get a sense of the life there on the front, and the life sort of just behind the front, like what's going on during the Spanish Civil War on that anarchist Republican side, when you're not constantly in battle with the nationalist Franco regime and the military, but you're sort of behind the lines a little bit. Like you're involved, but you're not constantly entrenching and facing imminent death. Um, and it's definitely is a no holds barred look. If you've read For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway, you're aware of the fact that both sides committed a lot of murder, a lot of atrocity. There, as in so many words, there were really no winners. There were just lots of losers, and two groups that sort of received violence from that anarchist side were the church and clergy, and then the sort of lower nobility who controlled estates or land. And so that's the first third, and you see it from the perspective of like a 22-year-old officer on the anarchist side. And he's writing these letters to somebody back home, but again, the letters are like 30 pages long, so they don't read like, it's not like in Dracula or Les Liaisons Dangereuses, where you're getting these 3-page letters like snippets. They're very long passages. And then the whole second third of the novel then is that character's his common law wife. So they've chosen not to marry. They regard that as a sort of bourgeois, archaic institution. So they have neither a church marriage nor a civil marriage, but they do have a child together. They live together. And so all of the middle section of the novel is a series of letters written by the woman in that couple, Trini, but they're not to the father of her child, Ruiz, who narrated the first third. They're to his best friend and a mutual friend they have from college, a man named Julie Solares, he's not quite the Mephistopheles of the novel, but he never narrates anything, but he's constantly sort of engaging in this like almost like Socratic dialogue, or this maybe more cynical dialogue, dialectic with the different characters, trying to either build them up or tear them down or just kind of make a mockery of everything. And he's probably the worst soldier in the group, but maybe the best person because of that. So the middle third is narrated by Trini, and they're letters to that Solares character. And that was probably the single most fascinating part. I thought the first third was just this masterpiece where I was like, whoa, this is like For Whom the Bell Tolls, except better. And it's written by, someone who is a combatant on that side. Like, this could be autobiographical in some sense. That middle third, though, is really interesting because she's living in Barcelona, and so she's in, there are bombings in the city, there are food shortages. She's trying to figure out, like, as sort of a single parent, like, does she need to go get a job at a local university and be working there? And as there's all the violence against clerics, she actually goes and she starts attending sort of an underground church, and so we get to look at what that would have looked like, and it's really, really fascinating to see not just the development of that character who really is just fully formed, but to see the perspective of what was going on, not just on the front or right behind the front, but removed from the front in sort of a city that should have theoretically been safer and ultimately is not safer. There are passages about when there are there are bombings at night in the city, and how harrowing this. It's some of the most terrifying descriptions I've ever read. And then the final third of the book is narrated by a character who's a medical orderly. So he's not the doctor, but he's sort of like has some training and helps out. And he interacts with these characters, and what ends up happening is they're posted in the winter to a tiny like village basically along this military front. And when the snows come in the mountains, it becomes clear there's not going to be any attack, and so everybody just kind of hunkers down, and it's safer out on those winter fronts where there's not going to be any combat. They really don't have gasoline to drive any vehicles. They don't really have much ammunition. They don't have artillery pieces. They don't have replacements for any of the material they've run out of. They're just foraging in these villages that have been abandoned by the people who are terrified of the violence. And so that front is actually safer than Barcelona. And so a whole bunch of the characters, their families, their wives, and even a couple of children come on up to that front and spend December and January and February on that winter front with them. And that's what the third passage is. And we see a look at, you know, the way that some of these characters are just con artists, and what Saleh's sort of, his attitude towards not just his own side as a defeated side in the war, but really recognizing that there were venal or corrupt individuals on his side throughout the war. There were atrocities committed throughout the war, murders. But it is really well written. I wanted to give a couple of sort of quotes or passages to suggest if you might like this. So one of them is, "Pity revolts me. It's a cowardly way people have invented to express their contempt and at the same time feel good. Perhaps passion is a cruel mystery. No pleasure can be compared to making one's idol suffer so we can wreak revenge for the way she inspires adoration. I saw hatred for the first time in her eyes, a fire that diminished all other feelings, just as red makes all other colors turn pale." And I mean, like, just incredibly lovely imagery. There's so much sort of philosophy and metaphysics going on across this novel of war. Love is sublime for the doer and obscene for the observer. If you give it a little thought, all a man and woman do when they kiss is to bring together the top ends of their digestive tubes. And that's from that Solaris character who's just mocking everything. And then from Trini, from that female character, to discover something would be to triumph. And only fools triumph. People who don't aspire to the unattainable. And so, I mean, there are these incredibly gorgeous tiny little gems and epigrams sprinkled throughout the novel. The descriptions of the war and the bombings are just absolutely harrowing. And I really, really highly recommend this. I was convinced that The Sleepwalkers by Herman Brock was going to be the best novel I read this year. I'd been looking for a copy for 10 years and finally found one. And then I just happened to pick up Uncertain Glory. And this was an excellent read. I'm definitely going to reread it. I highly recommend it. In terms of some of the war passages, although the setting and some of the themes are similar to For Whom the Bell Tolls, some of the war passages did remind me of the retreat from, I believe it's Caporetto. Yeah, the battle at Caporetto and Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. And then some of the narration and the language, the sense of relational conflict, like couple relational conflict, was very reminiscent of some of D.H. Lawrence's writings, especially maybe Women in Love, or The Rainbow, but more Women in Love, I'd say. And then the other, probably sort of my favorite Spanish novel is Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafon, which is set in Barcelona after World War II. So those are some books. If you've read any of those and like them, you might be curious about Uncertain Glory. And again, this is just a absolutely fantastic read. To me, it's probably one of the best novels of the 20th century now that I've finished it. So trying not to overpraise, but it was a great experience. So thank you, BookTube.